I'm JD, and this is the Christians for Impact podcast. We talk to Christians about the world's most pressing problems and what you can do to impact them during and after university. Today, we're speaking with Joy Bittner about the lack of mental health care among the Latin American poor and how to provide it. I don't know about you, but I personally know many people who struggle with anxiety, struggle with depression, and that's at a very high prevalence here in America and in Western Europe. Now, looking at places where there are many refugees and many other issues with poverty and violence and crime, we only see these rates going up and up. So the question is, what do we do about that? And as Christians who want to bring healing, restoration, and redemption, how can we help restore relationships also that people have with their own minds and their own bodies? Joy is really doing pioneering work, it seems, in this space. She has a lot of experience with nonprofit management, over 15 years, and she recently founded an org called Vida Plena. A meta-analysis of 45 peer-reviewed studies showed that Vida Plena's style of mental health intervention can be 9 times more cost-effective than direct cash transfers. So we talked with her about that and also about how her Christian faith informs her model of effective mental health. And additionally, in this episode, I'll be joined by my colleague, Asha. Joy, thanks so much for coming on.
Thanks so much for having me. Looking forward to having a bit of a chat conversation.
We are too. Thank you again. So you are calling in from Ecuador, is that right?
That is correct. So I am based in Quito, the capital, and it's high up in the Andes Mountains. Looking out from my window, there's a volcano in front of me and just kind of part of like the overall landscape of where we're at.
I wish we could get that through the podcast interview somehow, but maybe we can post links later. It sounds wonderful. How did you end up in Ecuador? Did you move there for Vida Plena, or were you already there?
Yeah. So first, I should just explain. So Vida Plena means a flourishing life in Spanish. And it is a nonprofit that I have founded with the goal of being able to provide mental health to low-income populations and refugees. So I've been in Ecuador now for 10 years and kind of working around Latin America for 15 in total. And I didn't come here originally for this. I really was interested after college and working in the international development space. And with that, just was able to get an initial job, kind of working in the Dominican Republic, did some different community development projects for a couple different years, different places. I was in Dominican Republic and Bolivia and Honduras, a few other places. But ultimately came to Ecuador to run a fair trade company in which we were working with indigenous artisans who made handmade jewelry. And so as part of that experience, it was like the kind of accumulation of different experiences I had led me to founding Vida Plena. The opportunities I had, I was able to spend time with people and get to know their lives and see the day-to-day challenges that they were facing. And there was like a few notable experiences in which some of the artisan women that we were working with, they had some serious problems. I think I like to talk about like mental health is the type of thing that people experience everywhere in developing spaces and in kind of quote unquote rich countries. Mental health is very much universal. And I think sometimes we have this idea, we have both, there's kind of like in the West, the quote unquote West, we have this idea of like either that people are poor but happy. And I think people sometimes they make go on a volunteer trip or missions trip and they have like these nice interactions with local people and they're like, wow, they're poor, but they're happy, which I think that speaks to people being really sociable or really friendly, but especially if there's a language barrier. And just even when you're just meeting somebody the first time, they're not going to tell you all of their personal woes and problems, right? Because that's not how people interact. And so I think sometimes we have like a superficial understanding. On the other side, sometimes I also hear that people think that poverty is going to be the cause of all mental health problems. And so if we could just solve poverty, then like there wouldn't be any mental health problems, which makes sense for only until you think about it. And you're like, wait, but that would mean then there'd be like no depression, no mental health problems in the US or UK, which we all know is like not true. So, really like mental health problems, depression, it's much more tied to a mix of genetics and life circumstances. And those conditions exist universally wherever you're based. So, kind of that's a long explanation. So, kind of coming around was what the big difference, though, however, is the lack of access. And so, in the developing world, there is a significant lack of access. According to like the Pan American Health Organization, about 3 out of 4 people in Latin America aren't able to receive any type of care. And so that is a significant difference. And I saw that personally. So how it was working with this one woman, very tragically, her husband had committed suicide. And so she was facing a lot of things, and her children were going through a lot of things. I was really trying to help get them connected to a psychologist and couldn't find one that was going to work for them, even like offering to pay the cost, which is again above and beyond like her ability to pay, but just with the logistics and the distances, just it wasn't, there was no feasibility there. And just kind of like those types of experiences just help you to see like these are some certain, there's needs here that aren't being met. And they have a significant impact on people's quality of life, because that's what it kind of comes down to. Um, I think so. This is like a longest answer, but I think sometimes people think of mental health and it's kind of like, okay, this space we put in the bucket of mental health, but there's physical health and there's other things. But like especially like as a Christian, I think it really just comes down to people are suffering and people are in a really difficult place. And so it just feels like it is our responsibility as Christians specifically to care for people. And so addressing that through the lens of mental health is one way to do that.
So, I mean, thank you so much for this explanation. And I think the first kind of question I would have would be, how did you come to care about that cause area, mental health specifically, in the first place? Like, what role did those like Christian motivations and kind of Christian, what role did your Christian background play in that? But also just, like why did you start caring about that? Why was it something that you wanted to spend your career on doing and supporting others?
Yeah, no, it makes a lot of sense. I think it's kind of coming back to that sense of like our callings as Christians are caring for people and just caring for people who are in a place of some kind of suffering. And you see that very acutely with people who are, I think all of us know, if you think about like your friend or someone in your family who you've seen go through a mental health problem, depression perhaps, I think if you picture that person, you walk alongside them, you're kind of like trying to help them through that. You see how much like they are very distinctly suffering. And that is like our calling as Christians to help people. And so we can put like a lens on it and we can put that lens on it and kind of call it mental health and give it that official title. But really what it is like caring for people who are in a place of hurting. And so that was kind of just like, I kind of came from that broad space background of wanting to help people kind of be able to live the lives that have a world of opportunity. Because I think if you think back to that good friend of yours you've seen struggle, or maybe yourself, it's like it robs people of like what they could be. And it sucks away people's like energy and their ability to be able to live their fullest potential. And one of the defining features of depression specifically is that it takes away pleasure in everyday activities. And I think that just like there's so much in the world that is good and beautiful, but when you're suffering from depression or other mental illness, that means you're not able to enjoy that. You're not able to be there for other people in your community. And so it's wanting to really help people to have live that full life. And as that is actually the name Vida Plena again, like means a flourishing life. It is coming from that motivation. It's not just like limiting it to like mental health in the sense of, okay, like we want to help people like be cured, quote unquote, if that was even possible. And then putting them at some sort of neutral baseline, it's much bigger than that. It's like really being able to help people to be able to experience life in the fullest. Because I think, and again, as a Christian space, that is what God desires for us.
So beautiful. Thank you for sharing. So you're an American, you have a lot of experience in Central America and Latin America, and you first went to do work with fair trade startups. Is that right?
Yeah. So I I'd been doing a number of different community projects, kind of in the health space. I started a small organization that did public health projects in Honduras. And then here in Ecuador, we were working again with the indigenous artisans doing fair trade.
So how
And
did you transition from fair trade to mental health? Was that a seamless transition? Was that just by way of meeting this friend who you mentioned their spouse had died and seeing the weight of that burden on them? Or was that a characteristic moment, or was there some other other way that came about?
yeah, I think for me, so my background professionally is I was a psychology major undergrad and had this idea of wanting to do international development. Didn't like quite know how to get into that, and then did a master's in social work in which I focused on social service administration. And then a little bit later, I did like a second master's in nonprofit management. And so I'm kind of coming in it at the angle of more of like project management and program development. And so that's how I was able to kind of like step from like fair trade over to mental health in the sense that um, I didn't come in it with as like an expert as a therapist or a mental health expert. I had like some broad strokes orientation, but not never done clinical work before. And so really what I'm doing then is like partnering with people who are the experts. And so specifically I've developed a partnership with Columbia University out of New York and the Global Mental Health Lab there, who are actually the experts in this model of therapy, which is looking there's a specific model of therapy that we're working with, which is recommended by the World Health Organization. It's the technical term for people who are interested. It's called task shifted therapy. But what that really actually means, it's a great model in that it means you can train local people, non-specialists. They don't have to have a degree in psychology or anything, but you can train people to be able to provide a very effective form of therapy. And this model this model grew out of sort of the recognition that there's more demand and more need than can be recognized, than can be met by the existing number of like professionals that are out there. And this is particularly true in the developing world. And so this model sort of grew up out of a great organization called Sangath out of Goa, India. There's also the Friendship Bench out of Zimbabwe. And sort of like these movements kind of happen parallel. About 10, 15 years ago, really began this like shift in the mental health space of recognizing the value of they call it the lay health worker. And so it's really just like people who receive some training, but they don't have like per se a psychology degree. They're not psychologists certified, but they're able to provide this type of therapy that is still really impactful and really effective. And so so that is so that's where I'm coming at it, is like, okay, so if community members can learn how to do this, I can as well. But then more importantly, as myself in my particular role, is that I'm really just like bringing together the different pieces, the different actors who are then able to make this program happen. And so kind of developed this interest in mental health based off of my experiences, but I was not personally like a psychologist or like seeing patients or anything to that extent before this. It was just more like, I think there's a lot of ways that one can apply your skills in different areas. And so if you have to some degree some generalist skills, they can be taken a lot of different directions.
That's really good to hear. I think a lot of us in university have this sense that if I want to focus on mental health, then I need to study psychology, and that's what I have to do. And if I don't do that, well, then I have to work on some other problem. But yeah, it's so exciting to hear your story of how working in project management gave you the skills to work with people, to work with the experts, and you were able to transition later in your career to this cause area. And I'd love to get more into what you're doing with Columbia University and some of the solutions you're finding. Could we talk a bit first about the problem of mental health in general, and then maybe also in particular in Latin America, actually, since you talked about it earlier. But how about specifically in Latin America? How does that compare to other regions in the world regarding mental health? Maybe some of the listeners are familiar with other programs in other parts of the world. For instance, Strong Minds, which works in sub-Saharan Africa. How does Latin America compare to sub-Saharan Africa in terms of mental health needs? And in what ways is it greater or less? In what ways Are there distinct needs? I'd love to hear more about that.
Yeah. Actually, going back a little bit, what you said a bit earlier, JD, about like the idea of people as they're thinking about building their career and how to kind of frame it and the impact. I'd have to say, like, I just want to like touch on that because I think it's kind of makes a lot of sense. I'm sure for yourself too. I imagine you never imagined you'd be in this kind of exact role, this space where you are, but kind of there's like these things that kind of come together. So yeah, so when I was in my master's program in social work school, I EA wasn't a thing yet, I'm a little bit older. And so there was no EA, but I had this broad feeling of like, I kind of like looking at it and just kind of had this feeling of like, okay, in the best case scenario, maybe I can see 30 patients a week as a therapist. And well, that's like very significant for those 30 people and their immediate family, the people that affects. That is like kind of it's not that many people in terms of like how you can affect them. It's like a deep impact. And so that is actually why I ended up part of the reasons why I chose to go more program administration and thinking about took my career that direction was because I had this hope of being able to have like a wider reach. Um, and so I think that would be something I'd like even just suggest to like students who are thinking about it is so EA is always very much thinking about impact. And I think impact can go to different directions. It can go like you can go deeper wide. And um, so if you're thinking about mental health, then specifically you can go deep and be like that person, that individual who is going to sit alongside someone, walk through their problems and like really spend that time and invest in a few specific individuals. Or you can kind of go wide and I'm doing something like what I'm doing is a little bit more like program administration and building out those services. And I would say what I think people should do is think about like what they personally find most motivating and like their personal skill set. Um, I was actually listening and doing like this morning, even I think in EA, people who take EA very, very seriously, I think are really hard about their impact, which I think is great. But I think you should do that, especially if you're younger and starting out, or even if you're further a bit along, actually the same. It's impact isn't just like an abstract concept of like, okay, this is the most impactful thing. It's really like, what is the most impactful thing for you personally? And so and I was thinking about that actually in the context of like, you talk about like the church body and how there's different parts of the body and not one of them are better than the others. And I think in EA, there can be this little bit of like minimizing of like, oh, that's less impactful. So it's like not as good of a role. Like you think of, I don't know, the kindergarten teacher, just
And
like
just to cut in
there.
here, because maybe not all of our listeners know what EA is. By EA, we mean using evidence and reason to find the best ways to do good, right? The EA idea and the community around that. Just to clarify as a footnote.
Oh yeah, sorry, effective altruism world. Yeah. So it's this high, and so like the cliche might be like, oh, the kindergarten teacher is not going to be the most impactful career. But and so you could say the same thing for like as a therapist. But I think you have to really look at and think about like what is it for me that I will be in my most impactful career and my personal most impactful life path. And so for some people, that really might be like that person who is going to sit down alongside and be the psychologist, be a therapist, and the social worker, and actually spend that time with individuals. And that's where they're going to find the most meaning. And that's really where they personally will have the most impact. And then, whereas like somebody else, like I don't, so then in my particular role, I don't spend my time doing therapy with people. I spend my time doing like spreadsheets and budgets and fundraising and working out bank account details and transfers and 1,000 other things. And so it's in some ways like I think sometimes people find it somewhat deceptive. They want to help people, but then there's like the sense of helping people is an abstract way. So I'm not interacting with people as directly. And so I think there's a little bit of a like self-evaluation of like what's going to be most impactful for me. Because at the end of the day, if you choose something, you like decide abstractly, this is going to be the most impactful thing, but then you are not happy in the day-to-day work, it's not going to be that impactful. So it's a little bit like knowing yourself. So that's like a long aside. I just kind of wanted to like share those thoughts because that's something I've been thinking about. So it's really recognition of like what makes you the most impactful. Yeah. So going back to the question then about like mental health rates in Latin America.
If I could say something here, I thought that was so on point. And I think oftentimes, yeah, we do think about impact in this kind of blackboard model sort of way. Like, oh yeah, if I could theoretically, see the secrets of the universe and like unlock the hidden doors to really make the biggest impact possible, what would that be? And that's just, for many people, a bit out of touch, right? You have to start with who you are, who God made you. Like you mentioned, what part of the body did God make you? Did God make you really, like, to use the body of the church as an analogy? Did he wire you to be more like the hands of service, or more like the thinking head that strategizes the operations? And I think that's a beautiful analogy, and a really healthy and holistic one as well. Asha,
Yeah,
you were
and
say.
something that I just want to add is that thinking about impact as an undergrad is such a stressful thing to do. You have like all those chats with people advising you on career, and that's what they're trying you to think about. What's the most impactful career that like anyone to some extent could take, given your background in your studies? But I found that really reassuring what you said about thinking, okay, like what's the best, like what's the most impactful job that I could have as myself, given like not only like my background in my studies, but where I am at, like people I know, and thinking kind of more broadly about that. So thank you for that from an undergrad perspective.
I think when I was an undergrad, I remember just feeling like this immense pressure. I didn't even think anybody didn't have an impact on it, but just like, what's your life going to be? You have to pick the thing. And all of a sudden it's so scary. It feels so overwhelming. And then I remember started talking to some older people a little bit further along in their careers. And something I noticed was occasionally that you bump into somebody, they're like, I knew I always wanted to be a teacher. I became a teacher, and I knew I was going to be a doctor. You bump into a few of those people, but most people had taken some like interesting twists along the way. And maybe some people had like done complete career shifts, or some people had kind of wide off. They kind of like specialized as they went along. They kind of fell into something, and then that became their niche. But it was like a little bit less like intentional. And I think it's great if you have that clarity, but if you don't, I think what makes sense is just take the next best step. It's just like take that next step that makes the best moment, like the best thing you can do for the next phase. And if you don't have that big picture, long-term thing clear, that's like, okay, just take that next best thing you can do. And that took like, when I realized that, took like some of the pressure off of me. And I feel like that has like really played out. And so I'm like a little bit older. I'm 37. And so I'm starting this organization now. And so felt like for a number of years that I wasn't really quite sure what I was supposed to be doing. I didn't really know if I'm on the right path. I was doing different things, and they all felt like overall good, but it wasn't like, oh, this is my thing. And when I look back now, I can see that it was definitely God like guiding and shaping my life and setting me up to be able to have like the right set of skills and experiences to be able to do this. And that wasn't clear in the moment, but looking back with a little bit of experience, I see that like, oh, that's why that opportunity came up. And like, that's why that role, and then like, or that's like why that one didn't work out in some ways. Sometimes there's not such clarity, but like, you can kind of in the big picture sense, I do see that. And I do see God like having shaped things. And so it's okay if like in that individual moment, it's like, I don't know if this is quite right, but if you're learning things and you're getting experiences, it will like contribute to the next step. And so I think that's like also helpful. Like that was always helpful for me to think about it that way. It's like, you don't have to have the whole thing figured, just figure out that next piece. And so I don't know for you, JD, like I'm curious, like how you've now come on with like with each, and like how that path is. Yeah. Do you also see that in your own life, the way that's kind of come together?
Yeah, I think that thinking, not in terms of, oh, is this the best possible thing in this chapter, but is this a great next step to position me down the path God wants me? I think, yeah, that has been true in my life. I think you run into this decision paralysis when you're open to anything, and you end up having to make decisions. And you also realize that like life gets very complicated, and you're balancing so many different factors. Like when I was thinking about career choice, I was also thinking about a long-term relationship, and you end up having to be very open in terms of timelines. And I definitely found myself not being able to plan for more than a couple years at a time, or whatever my next visa term was. I don't know if you've run into any similar issues with your travels and working in Ecuador as an American, but yeah, I definitely think that for some people, it does not make sense to look for that one career, lifelong career. And yeah, I definitely would not have guessed 3-4 years ago that I would be doing what I'm doing today. It sounds like very much the case also for you.
Yeah, I'd say so. So kind of looping it back around to Latin America and how I ended up here. So, like I mentioned, I was interested in international development work, and that was kind of what I wanted to do. Didn't know how to break into it, and kind of my broad strokes idea was like, well, that happens mostly in Africa, so I'll go to Africa. But I didn't. But I, it was just. But then, initial opportunity became available to go to the Dominican Republic, and then one opportunity leads the next opportunity, kind of then and next thing you know, I've like built my career in Latin America and I've never been to Africa. Um, and so I think there's also um, a sense of like that's like letting life unfold the way it does, and kind of going then back to like the high impact. So as I did become more aware of like effective altruism and became more involved, some kind of the questions came up of like, well, why are you starting Vida Plena in Ecuador and Latin America? Like, is that the highest need place? And is that the like most cost effective place that you could be doing this? And kind of if you were just to put together a spreadsheet of tables and numbers, perhaps not. But my competitive advantage at this point, it is. And so that's again going back to like a little bit of like the body of Christ and just also your own personal like abilities. So after having developed a career in Latin America and spending like 10 years in Ecuador, I speak Spanish fluently and I have a large network and connections within academia and the startup world and things like that. And so Ministry of Health, it just made sense. Like perhaps if you were to put together a spreadsheet, you could say that India is going to be a higher impact for an abstract person, perhaps. But for me personally, there's clearly going to be no advantage for me to like start over in a totally different language and culture. Um, and so that is a little bit like part of that reality. And I think that is just knowing like where you're personally best advantaged makes sense to kind of focus on that and being okay with that. So kind of with that though, to kind of just put some numbers around it. So like Latin America in terms of depression is relatively on par with the US. So that means like basically if you look at overall depression rates, they're about 5 to 7% of the population at any given point. And that's similar in Ecuador, in Latin America as the US, broad strokes. Um, there's some other places in the world that are a little bit higher. There's some of the places that you might expect to have like more, there's more like civil unrest and war. They do have higher rates of mental illness and depression because some of those circumstances do then influence that. But yeah, so that is kind of like, that's a little bit like Latin America specifically. What is interesting though about Latin America is I think there's this like growing openness that people are aware of mental health illnesses and the importance of addressing them. However, there's just, again, like that real strong lack of access that people have. And so, like what is available here, for example, is there are some like private healthcare, mental health care. You could go to a private psychologist. And that's what people maybe in the upper class would do. However, for people in the bottom of the proverbial pyramid, that is like completely unaffordable. And so they are just being underserved. There's a few government options. As you would imagine, it's really difficult to get an appointment, long waiting times, just really inadequate based off of the need. Um, so yeah, so that is a little bit like, but kind of like both sides of the coin of like why Latin America. Um, Other thing I noticed, so I decided to modeling my program after you mentioned Strong Minds, which is a really fantastic organization that's based out of Uganda, and they are using that model of therapy that I mentioned before, where you train community members and then specifically in a group therapy model. So it is like very cost effective. And so I'm replicating that here in Ecuador. And then going back to that partnership with Colombia, working with a team who originally trained Strong Minds, and they've also worked with a number of different organizations around the world, UN Refugees, Care International, HIAS, a lot of these kind of like very big development organizations. And they're also now training my team here. So really excited about that collaboration. I feel like the ability to count on the experts to make sure we're really setting up things right from the beginning has been crucial. So um, yeah, so that's a little bit kind of where we're at.
So there's definitely a need. There's definitely an undertreated need, right? I think you said that 3 out of 4 people in Latin America go untreated. So that means in Latin America, there are millions of people who are suffering from depression who don't have any kind of treatment or therapy or medication. And so there's a lot of different ways that we can meet this need. So maybe one would be to work within the government to maybe increase funding for government-sponsored therapists. Maybe there's a private sector need where maybe more people could just specialize in this within these individual countries. And then there's this nonprofit approach where you provide these services at below market or at no cost, right? And that sounds like that's the approach you're going for. That's the approach that that the World Health Organization and others that you've worked with are going for. Strong Minds has gone for this talk therapy approach. Can you help us get a sense of which approaches seem most effective, and why talk therapy of all? Why does that seem particularly helpful?
Yeah. So just like I'll give a kind of like a broad overview of like the way our program works. So what we do is we train local community members to be able to be group facilitators. And specifically, we're using a model of therapy called interpersonal therapy, which is on par as kind of the top evaluated therapies. Cognitive behavioral therapy might be familiar to other people. They're that space. And it's considered one of the gold star therapies for treating depression. It has an immense body of evidence behind it demonstrating its impactfulness. And so the way we do that is we have actual community groups that come together, local community people in their actual neighborhood, and they spend then 8 weeks. It's a short-term therapy, and they spend 8 weeks meeting together and just being able to like kind of grow and learn. And I want to really highlight that group aspect because I think that is like absolutely critical of like what we're doing. It's because again, like I want to start. I think what we're trying to do is we're starting with mental health. We're starting with treating people for depression, but the idea is then that grows from there. The experience of like Strong Minds and a lot of other organizations who use this model is that a lot of the groups after the official meeting period decide to continue meeting together informally without the facilitator who's guiding them. And that's because they've found that community support is so critical. And so what we're really doing is we're emphasizing that as like a way for people to be able to develop those stronger networks. I think so much this is the truth. This is the case in especially the Western world, but also here even more as what society kind of goes forward, is we're increasingly separated and we are losing some of those previous contacts. But even in different rural areas, you see that like there's this need for human connection. And when you provide that for people, it becomes such a source of strength. And so then these groups, what we're really trying to incentivize here is that these groups then transform not just for being like a depression support group, but that it becomes like as people are able to really kind of come out of some of the depression, the really intense levels of depression, and going to the experience of Strong Minds, like about 85% of people that go through their program do see a significant reduction in their symptoms. And so as people improve, they're able to focus on other aspects and other lives and other aspects of like how they can give back to their community. And that's really what we're working to do, is like build these strong networks of people who have come together around a specific issue. And then when they're at the right place, is to be able to turn that around, and that it can be such like to be able to transform society at a broader level. And so really kind of building from the ground up is very much like a community-based model.
It sounds quite good. So group talk therapy in the case of Strong Minds was able to reduce symptoms by 85% among those treated. So can you help us get a picture of like what that means for somebody personally, right? So does that mean that they just feel a little bit less depressed, or what I guess what would qualify, or what would be like an average person before and after going through this group talk therapy?
Yeah. So the reason like also kind of group talk therapy opposed to like the other model that people might use is like they'd use like some sort of pharmacological assistance, right? So you're taking antidepressant pills. And a lot of the evidence, there's kind of broad body of evidence, like that is very effective. And for a lot of people, the best is kind of like, maybe it might be a combination of the two. Um, However, with a lot of people might be familiar, like antidepressants also come with a negative range of side effects. And there's all of these pieces as well, access in developing world. And so there's just like less risk focusing if you're just doing talk therapy opposed to like mixing antidepressant pills in as well. You don't have to have like a psychiatrist who's overseeing that. It makes the program cheaper, like easier to kind of run. Whereas like if you were prescribing medication, then you'd have to have that aspect. Um, and I think also the benefit of like talk therapy, and specifically the way we're setting it up, is like it's about people learning the skill, not just like fixing the symptoms of what they're going through, but actually like learning the life skills to be able to address that in the future. So it's not just like, okay, this is like this particular moment.
It's much
of
more
depression.
sustainable, right?
It's like, yeah, how do you kind of go forward from there? And
right. So take someone who's depressed, who starts this talk therapy. How does that process work? How long does it take? What's that look like?
So yeah, it's 8 sessions, hour and a half each. And kind of like, I'll just like talk about someone that I had worked with initially. And when we started working together, she had a lot of social anxiety, so much so that we have like, we'd maybe do like little small homework assignments in between sessions. And example for her was like going to the local corner store and just like talking to the cashier, just like a way to kind of build that up. And then she did a great job. I mean, she did a lot of work on herself and like really put the effort in. And so it got to the point by the end that she had developed a strong friendship with another woman. And she had always kind of had these like ongoing problems with her boyfriend. And so she was telling her friend about it, and her friend's like, oh, you should talk to your therapist. And she went and she had the conversation with her boyfriend. They were able to work through their problems. And then she said that the reason she was able to do that was because she realized she had developed like a stronger network of people around her, that her boyfriend wasn't the only person in her life. And so like being able to talk to him and dealing with that problem, that conflict, she could take that head on. And that's just like, it's like a very small transformation, but in some ways, and for her experience, that was like huge. It was huge because she was able to actually deal with her problems because she knew there was other people in her life that were going to be there to support her. And it was just
right. And this
like,
program
like
gives you those people, right? So it's an 8-week program, I think you said, or is it 8-session program?
Yeah.
Right, with a group of 5, 6, 7 other people, or what's an average group size?
Yeah, 6 to 8 people.
Okay, 6 to 8 people, and then you go in, and you have one trainer who guides the discussion. Is that right? And you've actually been training some of these trainers, but what are these trainers taught, and what exactly do they do to create this community bond, this support system?
I think what it really is like there's something really special about people coming together and being vulnerable. I think we've all experienced that, and imagine like in a lot of the conversations with each, it encourages that as well. Like being able to come together and have like a space where like you're supposed to be vulnerable here, and then once you do, it's amazing. And so that is what the group, kind of the quote unquote magic of the group is like just giving people permission to be really honest about the struggles that they're going through, and then to feel that support from the other people. And so just as a side thought of like, as you have friends or somebody who's going through that, just being that supportive person makes such a huge difference, much more than you like think it might. Just having that person knowing that they have someone who's like interested in their lives and cares about them will make a huge, tremendous difference. And that is like really what's happening in the group. And so the facilitator's job is to just create that space very intentionally. So like giving people permission, quote unquote, like, please talk about this. Let's talk about what happened this week, tying that into their symptoms, tying that into like what's going on in their depression, and how is they're kind of looking at very much the bi-directional relationship of depression and their relationships and their symptoms. And so like if you're having like a stronger moment of like more depression, that's going to negatively affect your relationships. Or if there's problems in your relationships, of course, that's going to cause more depression. And so the facilitator is helping make those connections. They're also doing things like, let's talk in great detail about like maybe the conversations you're having, how those communications can be improved. Maybe there's like decisions that need to be made, and kind of weighing the pros and cons. And so some ways, again, because this is like a non-specialist, it's not something that like a very good friend might be able to do. If you have like a very thoughtful, considerate, like emotionally intelligent friend, they might be able to do some of these things for you. But unfortunately, like, a lot of people don't have that person in their life. And so then again, this is like facilitating that intentional space. And yeah, so then people come through, be able to like learn really like new skills that they're then able to apply in other areas of their life.
So just being in this group where people are intentionally vulnerable, intentionally open, while in a pretty sensitive state, right? These are people who are suffering with depression, who also likely in other respects have difficult lives. I mean, we all do, but I imagine the people here have even more so their own challenges and struggles. And just being in a space with 5, 6, or you said 6 to 8 other people, where everybody's opening up about those struggles they're going through, and is it just opening up, or is there any specific recommendations people are giving each other? Or is it simply just being vulnerable that creates relief? Where does the relief come from? I guess I can speak from experience from Bible studies and from talks with pastors that opening up is, I mean, there does come relief from that, right? And what we read in scripture, of course, the truth will set you free. And sometimes that's a very freeing, liberating experience. But are there any other aspects of this group talk therapy that provide that 85% reduction in symptoms that you mentioned earlier?
I think part of it, a huge part of it, is knowing that you have that sense of support and that you have other people who are coming alongside you. And then there's also a critical aspect of learning to be able to build like networks of support even outside of the immediate group, whether that's within your family, extended family, your contacts, your neighborhood. So knowing that you're not alone and not being social isolation is one of the kind of newest and most terrible kind of modern ills that I think is getting more attention, but like still needs more. So like helping people build those sort of connections. So specifically with the Vida Plena, we are focusing on people who are very low income or refugees. And so their life circumstances are exceptionally challenging. I was working, so Ecuador is within the region. There's a lot of refugees who have come specifically from Colombia and Venezuela. So for people who are not geopolitics very specific, but Colombia has a lot of problems with gangs related to drug wars and problems with that. And so a lot of people have been affected, have been like become refugees because there's a lot of intense violence. And then in Venezuela, their entire national government system is melted down, and there's like exceptional levels of like economic problems. And because of that, then like also organized crime there too. And so a lot of people have fled. And throughout different parts of Latin America, and Ecuador particularly has received a lot of refugees. And I mean, people have very real, tangible problems. They maybe don't have papers. They have difficulty getting work. They face discrimination. They can't get their kid enrolled in school. There's like very concrete problems that people are facing. And so like, what I do like to point out is like, so mental health is not going to be the cure all of all their problems. If you can't get a visa to be able to work legally, that's not going to be fixed. However, if you have depression on top of that, then you don't have the emotional resources to be able to face that problem and be able to take it on. And I think that's so it's kind of like that compounding effect. And so what we're really trying to do with Vida Plena is partner with other organizations who are offering those other kind of wider range of services, whether it's legal support or housing or livelihoods for getting work. Because it really, people, if you're at a point where like you can't face these problems that are already so overwhelming, because you're suffering from depression on top of it, then it's like you just won't have like the emotional resources necessary to be able to deal with it. And so it really needs to be kind of like part of this like broader package. And so I don't like to highlight that like mental health is going to be the fix all for that, but it is like a key part of like the overall services that somebody needs. And so so that is kind of just like a sense of like who we're working with. And so like a very concrete example, small thing, it's like this is where people are coming from. A girl comes to mind. She was living in Venezuela, and she started like a small, this like micro business, and she was selling cakes out of her home. And then very common there was like armed groups that began to like extort her, and she didn't have the money to be able to pay for it. And so so they were then threatening her life. And she's like, in Venezuela, that's not a joke. That's like, if you're getting death threats, that's because they're serious. And so she had to flee. And so obviously like having to leave her family and those circumstances are going to be very hard. But then really like was what we did specifically, this kind of going back to your question, like, what do we do? Helping her process some of those feelings of like, okay, she's had to leave. she had to leave her family behind. Now she's in this new place. How does she build up a new network of people? How does she make connections? And like there's kind of sometimes they're like these small things, but it's like helping her realize she does have people she can call on, and then like helping her like build and kind of strengthen those connections have helped her to be able to accept like this new place that she's in and start to feel like, okay, this is a place where I can see myself living and I can kind of build up a good life here. And so that's a little bit of like some of the pieces that we might be processing. It's obviously every individual is different and everybody's circumstances are different, but it's like those would be some of the pieces that we'd be like working on in the therapy.
And so, given how complex and just, yeah, I would say how much mental health depends on each individual, like their context and everything, given how difficult it is to measure mental health, how does Vida Plena do that? And how do you think are the best ways to measure mental health and like measure the improvement?
Yeah, so we're using it's actually I would say it's not as hard to measure. It's not that hard to measure mental health. You could just ask people. It's actually very concrete. You ask people, how do you feel? And they will tell you. And so there are specific psychological measurements and instruments that have been like verified across cultures, across contexts. Without getting
Can
too
you
into
give us
the
some
weeds.
examples of those?
Yeah, so we specifically use what's called the PHQ-9, which is a standardized instrument for it's like the patient health qualification, 9 questions on depression. And that's so we do that, and then a whole range of other instruments at the beginning of like the person's therapy. And then specifically every single week, we use this 9-question survey about people's depression symptoms. And so you're actually able to see very concretely how they change from week to week as people answer it. You could argue there's the criticism like, well, it's a subjective scale. Of course, it's a subjective scale. It's like how someone feels. We're talking about people's emotions. So that is not, it's like subjective, but it's also the most subjective thing possible is like how someone actually feels. And so with that, you're able to actually to see like, so the girl that I mentioned before, like she started out with a very high score of being like moderate, like semi high to medium to high levels depression. And then by the end of like the time that we were working together, she was consistently no symptoms, no symptoms, no symptoms. And so you actually really are very tangibly able to measure that progress and track it on a graph of like how that person has changed. And so in that sense, like it is very much evidence-based therapy and using those sorts of instruments. So Beck is another common one. The GAD, the GAD is another instrument. Those are all very common, like within the mental health space, and are broadly been verified.
Do we have a sense of how long this effect lasts? So take this woman you were describing with the extortion issue, who went through the group talk therapy, and she had a relieving of her symptoms of depression. Do we see that persisting in the longer term future, or have we measured consistently that far with these group talk therapies?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's definitely kind of worth pointing out. There's broadly kind of major 2 different types of depression that you could kind of categorize. There's chronic depression, and then there's major depressive episodes. And so chronic depression is very much is people, as the name suggests, people who have suffered for depression for a very long time, and they more often have relapses. And so that is normal. And that is like, but then what we will work with then in that space is like how to mitigate the symptoms so they're not as severe every time. And so I do want to point that out that this is not magic. And there are people who do suffer for depression for a very long time. And that is like very real. And so it's more of like for those people, it's learning how to manage the triggers and also kind of manage like what are the circumstances that help it to not be as extreme. For people who have like what's considered then the other category is a major depressive episode, that's a little bit more triggered by a circumstance often. And that could be like in the case of the woman I mentioned, her transition as a refugee, could be from a loss of a loved one, could be from a loss of an important relationship, whether it's death or breakup. And so what's important there is helping the person to work through that specific experience so that it doesn't transform that into a chronic depression. Um, and chronic depression doesn't always have to be triggered by an event. It could also be hormonal, different things, but genetic. Um, and so, but so then kind of like, so those people specifically who are more like focused on a major depressive episode, we do see that the impacts are quite lasting. And that's not to say that the someone doesn't have life problems, they don't have like low moments, but it doesn't transform itself into a crippling depression. And actually,
So
very
does
recently,
yeah, if I can interject, is group talk therapy mostly is it mostly aimed for people who are suffering bouts or more seasonal episodes of depression, or are they equally also targeting at helping people suffering from chronic depression? My guess is it's more the first than the second. Is that right?
I'd say both. It helps both. I think people that definitely is meant to be both people are able to benefit from a group talk therapy. Absolutely. People who have like a long-term chronic depression, they will probably see like maybe a little bit less of a change, but they are still able to actually truly benefit from that as well. So anecdotally, I just wanted to point out that like your question of like how does that work? And so like are the impacts lasting? So I'd mentioned a little bit earlier a different woman who had like she started with the social anxiety and how she developed that network of people. And I just actually just saw her yesterday and we were kind of catching up and informally. And I just mentioned, I was like, oh, and how are things going with your boyfriend at the moment? And she's like, oh, yeah, we broke up last week. He decided, whatever, circumstances. And I was just like, wait, we've just had a half-hour conversation and you haven't even mentioned that. You seem like you're doing really well. I'm kind of shocked because before she talked about codependency issues and I was just shocked. And she's like, yeah, she's like, it was pretty hard the first couple of days, but she's like, I've got a lot of other things going on in my life. I've got her work and her study, all these other things, all these other positive things. And she's like, so it was hard. I definitely had a couple hard days, but then, it's okay. And I was just like, this is incredible because in the past she had talked about every single breakup had just led her into this terrible depression and just really hard. And I was like, you are the most, this is like really incredible how it just like changed that space of like, so again, it's not that she didn't have a hard moment when that breakup happened, but it didn't suck her down into an ongoing sort of depressive episode. And that is because of the skills she was able to learn and apply.
I can definitely see how the skills you would learn from a group therapy session like that could become lifelong skills. I think it must also be hard to measure, right? Like I can see how it would impact someone's longer term future, but I can also see, just thinking of cases of friends and acquaintances who kind of slip back in the same depressive episodes. Instances where people they seem to have a harder time learning how to get back on 2 feet, right? And I am interested in. Yeah, I am quite curious how that effect persists, not just after 1 year, but after 5 years or 10 years, like the really long-term future for people's lives. Do you know anything about that in particular? And has HLI done anything in the past researching those longer-term outcomes?
Yeah, HLI specifically hasn't done that. HLI has been looking at really interested in kind of cost-effective analysis, comparing different interventions to kind of like the Give Well standard of give directly and direct cash transfers. And so, just as like a specifics, they looked at very carefully at Strong Minds, again, the organization I'm replicating, and they found that Strong Minds is 9 times more impactful than direct cash transfers, such as Give Directly. And for those people who are not familiar, often in the effective altruism world, in some like development spaces, direct cash transfers where you just give somebody cash, it's kind of considered like the baseline in terms of cost effectiveness because you're just giving money away. And that's considered to be kind of, if you can't have a program that's more effective in that way, you might as well just give away the money. So they were looking at Strong Minds and found them to be 9 times more effective, specifically in terms of subjective well-being. And what subjective well-being is there's this whole range of studies where they ask people subjectively, like, so how does this impact your life? How do you feel about it? And that's just like a way of being able to compare interventions opposed to using like metrics such as income or DALYs, which are health-based sort of focus. And so Happier Lives Institute is very much interested in looking at subjective well-being as a way to be able to compare interventions in terms of cost effectiveness. So that's kind of like that sense. But then to go to your question, JD, about like long-term effects of like talk therapy, I know specifically there's, for example, if you're able to, there's higher rates of like depression, especially in like young adults, adolescents and young adults. And if you're able to address that early, it really helps. It really does make a transformational difference in that not developing into a chronic lifelong depression. So someone, especially in that age frame of like adolescent, young adult, is able to get help, it makes a big difference in kind of changing their life trajectory. On the other hand, we do see also high rates of depression at the other end of the life spectrum of like older adults, people who are then retired. They've kind of like lost some of like their social connections. They're no longer working. Maybe they're like somewhat isolated. There's also at the other end of the age spectrum, higher rates of depression. And so I think that really speaks to like the importance of community.
Yeah, definitely. So, well, it sounds like HLI's estimates of subjective well-being improvements from group talk therapy sessions from Strong Minds, similar ones that you're doing. It sounds like these are then measuring shorter term improvements, and maybe it could even be better, right? It sounds like these are maybe more conservative estimates based off of shorter term measurements, but longer term measurements could also show that those effects continue into the future. Is that correct, or are there just assumptions being made about the longer term that that they haven't measured, but they're just making these assumptions?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, there are definitely like I know HLI and their estimates are somewhat conservative and trying not extending too far out just because they want to be able to be more conservative in that impact. But one of the other interesting things to look at is also what is called like spillovers. And that's basically the impact on immediate family and kind of like their surrounding community. If anybody has someone in their immediate family, or maybe a parent or a sibling who's been suffering from a mental illness, you know how much that impacts your family. And so there's also that sort of like overall sort of like impact. If you can help one person, you're not just impacting their immediate life, you're actually impacting a brighter range of people. So that's also kind of an interesting. They're also small kind of statistic in terms of like investment. I remember seeing one place was like just like the return on investments, like for every dollar invested in mental health, there's like the World Health Organization estimates that there's a $4 return. And that's for people who are interested in like the economics of it. And that really comes down to like loss of productivity in workplaces, the cost of treatment, things like that. And so it's like really interesting just as economists like to look at these kind of like numbers into the broader economy. Addressing mental health issues does really have that like payback in the broader society.
Speaking of economists, I was actually talking to an economist this weekend who was talking about RCTs. And I know you mentioned that we've done RCTs with group talk therapy in sub-Saharan Africa, in Uganda. I think that's where it was. Now, one thing we know from RCTs is that we can do these randomized control trials. We can do these sort of A, B, C, and so forth tests to see whether we're having the impact that we want to have with an intervention, with a program. And we can control everything else and just change one thing to see if we're having that impact. And one thing this economist was telling me is that with RCTs, we have to keep doing them because when we try to do nonprofit interventions in different places in the world, we realize that conditions are actually very different, and sometimes in ways we don't expect. Are there conditions that are present in the depression and in the mental health issues of the poor in Latin America that maybe wouldn't be present in the poor in Uganda? And how does Vida Plena's approach adapt to that?
Yeah, I 100% agree on the importance of what you're saying of being based on evidence. And that is like one of the key values that I've developed that Vida Plena is based off of, is having a strong evidence base for the work that we're doing. And that kind of comes from like two sides. I feel like there's a lot of like nonprofits out there that have like really great intentions and are probably doing good. They probably are doing some kind of good, but there's also this sense of like people who are poor, their lives are already fairly complicated. They don't have access to public transportation. Everything is just like a lot more complicated for them. And so I don't want to like burden them with like an intervention, a program that like isn't that certain to help them. It just doesn't, just like, it seems like absolutely disrespectful. And then on top of it, if it's somebody who's struggling with depression and mental illness, to give them like a false promise would be absolutely terrible. I want to be certain. Again, you can't guarantee 100% everybody, but guarantee that like most people who go through this program will see a significant benefit. And so part of that is like very strong like shutdown criteria. If like we don't see people improving at the rates we expect, then we'll have to like either seriously pivot or consider like reshaping the organization, potentially even shutting it down. So I think that is like a strong focus of like having that like and measuring carefully along the way. And so then again, kind of your question of like how do you adapt based off of like local circumstances. And so what we're doing again is, like I said, mentioned, like partnering with local organizations who are the experts and very much relying on their feedback on like, okay, here's how like culturally, like what's appropriate and how people expect to react and things like that. So it's kind of like working, it's very much relying on locals. And so actually on the Vida Plena team, I am the only non-Ecuadorian that we're working with. And so just as like as a side note. And so I think that is like very much like relying on that kind of like people, local expertise and people who are really understand like the population that we're working with.
I think this is really interesting. It's, of course, a really complicated problem. How do you replicate group talk therapy that worked in Uganda, in Ecuador, and so forth? And I definitely second what you're saying about the importance of evidence-based interventions. I want to dig a bit deeper into one thing you said, which is that your team is almost exclusively Ecuadorians, that you're the only, I think you said the only non-Ecuadorian on your team. And I think one benefit of this is that you can provide this service for much less money, right? I know Strong Minds can provide group talk therapy for around, last time I checked, maybe around $120 per person for all the sessions, with the 85% success rate of lowering symptoms of depression. But you were saying you can do it for less. So how much can you do it for, and why can you do it for so little?
Yeah, we expect, so I should step back. We're in the process right now of, we're in fall 2022, running our very first pilot. And so we have just hired our first round cohort of community facilitators, and we're going to be starting training with them this Saturday. So it's very exciting. And so what we expect to be able to do that is, it is like we're still in the process of being able to figure out like what our exact costs will be. I have like some strong estimates right now. I do think we'll be about on par with Strong Minds, maybe a little bit slightly under. And I think the main reason that we're able to do that is exactly what you mentioned, is the fact that I'm relying on local expertise. And so our overall structure is that we are registered as a nonprofit in the US, but all of our operations and then the entire operations team is going to be based in Latin America, currently in Ecuador. So we're starting in Ecuador, and then the plan is in the next 3 to 5 years then to be able to expand to other countries within the region. But throughout there is like a really just great group of people in Latin America who are highly educated, a number of people who have even master's degrees from the US and Europe. And so really talented group of people that I can rely on to be able to run all the day-to-day operations, and at a competitive local salary that is then still much cheaper than like a US European salary. So I think that's kind of where we're able to have kind of like come out competitively a little bit different. But yeah, that's not to say like, I think there's different kind of costs in different places, and as effective altruists are always looking at like kind of the cost effectiveness of different regions. It is like an important consideration for sure. But what I really like love to emphasize again is kind of that sense of like, because it's like maybe more cost effective in one place doesn't mean you want to neglect people somewhere else. And so our focus is really being able to tie into that like local expertise. And then as that focus, like making sure the majority, not all of our staff as much as possible is Latin American. So that's kind of where we're coming in.
Yeah, you're doing really good work there, and definitely want to encourage you to keep up that good work of working with local expertise, but also working with M&E experts. You mentioned some researchers from Columbia. I'm also just curious, like how this compares to treatment in the US. I certainly would never want to discourage anyone from seeking treatment in the US, but if you're listening and you're considering maybe earning money to give it away or just giving away a portion of your income, it does sound like, at least on face value, you can provide relief from depression at a much lower cost if you're working with Vida Plena or with Strong Minds, right? Because that's maybe $120 per person compared to many thousands, right? Many thousands of dollars in the US or the UK. Is that about right?
Yeah. Yep. I believe I agree. I think Strong Minds is about 120, and we're estimating to be right about there as well, which feel very good about, given that's our first year of operations. Costs are always a little bit higher as you're setting things up. So, and then hopefully as we go in year 2 and 3, we'll definitely be able to come in lower. That said, I don't love to play the comparison game of like criticizing other organizations. I think Strong Minds is doing really important work. It's just a different context.
Different context,
so,
right?
Yeah.
And how many people are we talking about here? I know you mentioned you would need to train something like 60 facilitators to lead these group talk therapy sessions. How many people does that translate to receiving treatment?
Yeah, so we're hoping. So right now we're doing our pilot, and we're kind of like starting initially smaller to be able to set that up properly. But the goal is then for like next year to be able to start to expand pretty quickly. And like one group facilitator is able to reach a number of people. And so one group facilitator in any particular cycle could be working with about 50 or so people every 8 weeks. And so that does like translate to, we're hoping to be able to reach like a couple of thousand pretty quickly. And so we're kind of see exactly the right way to like scale up, but that's like broadly kind of the direction we're taking it. And so, yeah, in terms of cost effectiveness and scalability, it is like absolutely, it's really exciting kind of where it can go. Again, relying on that local expertise of like these local community members.
Are there any bottlenecks in this? Is it maybe training the facilitators? It sounds like you're doing that all by yourself. Maybe maybe there's some other bottleneck in the pipeline, but I imagine that takes quite a lot of time. Or is the bottleneck more funding, or is it more marketing these group talk therapy sessions, marketing these services to the beneficiaries? Where is it exactly that prevents this from scaling another 10x?
Yeah, I think right now we're focusing on really developing the program model correctly. But once we're really able to scale, so we hope in 2023 to reach about 2,500 people. So again, that's like not huge, but it's like full year 1. And being able to do that for under $100, about $100 a person. So like really at that point, once we have like our model 100% set, would be kind of implementing at scale, would be running a number of trainings and then like organizing the groups. And so the trainings they last 7 days total. And then there's like ongoing like weekly follow-ups, of course. And yeah, I think so. Like for us, for scaling is wanting to feel like we have like our structure set up really well in place. And then it does feel like it'll be the type of thing that can really move quite quickly.
Are you excited for that? Are you ready for this to grow, or are you happy with where it is right now?
This is like, it feels like the most exciting thing I've ever been part of. So we're here kind of getting the pilot really right off the ground, actually working with people. We've kind of done some like pre-pilot. We've had some pre-pilot groups that have been happening.
Who is it that you're working with at Columbia? You might have mentioned it earlier, but I think I missed it.
Yeah, I'm working with, it's called the Global Mental Health Lab. It's specifically their director and founder is Leonard Relly. And then I have a local team of 4 psychologists that I'm working with. And then I have a local partner organization. It's a nonprofit called Alas de Colibri, which is the wings of the hummingbird, which is specifically focused on working. They help people in low-income situations and refugees be able to provide kind of this like broader suite of services. And so we've partnered with them. Some other smaller groups that are specifically focused on refugees as well. And so when I say we, this is kind of like this growing team that I've been able to put together of different organizations and kind of a few specific key individuals. I should also mention that we went through, I have a local psychologist that I'm working with, and she and we went through the charity entrepreneurship program as co-founders, Anita Caslin. And so that's kind of like the we team so it's not just myself at this point. I definitely couldn't be pulling all of this off. And then have had a really great number of volunteers who've also given some of their time. And so Sam from Happier Lives has helped with like a CA, and some different volunteers who've helped with websites and different aspects. And so really huge number of people. It's really 100% not me. It is really a great group of people who have come together around this idea of like, how can we make this happen?
Awesome. I would love to dig in just for a couple minutes that we have left here into advice for Christians at university who want to make a difference in this space, who feel called to help those who are suffering from mental health issues. You mentioned earlier that you don't have to study psychology to make an impact in this space. Now, if you let's just say you're a generalist, you can do a lot of different things. And the most important thing is that you help as many people suffering from mental health problems get better as possible. What paths would you recommend if someone was just completely open? What are some things they should consider in terms of degree programs for undergrad, and then maybe also graduate programs? Let's start first with studies.
Yeah, I think even stepping back from like what major should one pick or something like that, I think the most important career thing that I've ever is just like actually doing as many internships and practical experiences as possible. I think that's like, it almost matters less what those internships are as much as like you actually do them, opposed to like picking a course to study, because that will, one, give you a sense of like what work looks like in the real world. And do you like that type of work or not? Is that like a good fit for you? Do you see that as being interesting work? And then also,
so what are some internships and work experiences that someone who's, say, still in undergrad that they could get that would give them a good sense of what would be a good fit for them?
Yeah, do you have any names like in mind of any organizations that people should check out or just apply to?
Yeah, I think that's going to really depend. That'd be so, like, to be able to give specific organizations going to depend so much like where you're personally based. But I would say is actually just more as like actually seeking out those opportunities through your career office. And so I think you could do things like sometimes there'll be like local social service. If you are interested in like working more directly with people, you could look for opportunities working with like social services that are working directly social service programs. And so you're trying to get as much hands-on experience there. Think also, but to think even a little bit broader is like, maybe you don't want to become that therapist, but there's a lot of different like support services. It's like that, maybe not even a generalist, but you're working for the overall good of the organization. So you'll be able to focus on marketing, or you're focusing on like the accounting and the finance. So you can develop like specific skills and then decide that you're going to apply them working for a mental health organization, but you're not going to be the quote unquote therapist yourself. So that said, like, for people looking for very specific career advice in the US, if you're interested in mental health, I would say consider like social work as like a field. There's a lot of different aspects of social work or different populations that people could work with, whether it's homelessness, drug and alcohol dependencies, a lot of different like aspects, specifically maybe prison populations. That's a little bit like cheaper and more direct than, say, becoming like a psychologist, which has a very long career path and is very competitive. There's also like school counseling programs, educational psychology. There's a lot of different like aspects. But so I think it really is like kind of like getting your feet wet and like trying different things out and seeing like what feels like a better fit for you, because that will give you real life experience. And then it also will actually help you as you get out in the real world, like having done something more than just like picking a particular study space.
Did you ever try this yourself? Did you ever shadow a psychologist, or were you already further in your career and you just you just went ahead and tried a much different approach. Yeah, because I heard that from friends who were pre-med. They could shadow a doctor. I imagine, although this might be a bit confidential, right? You could maybe shadow a psychologist, or at least meet with a psychologist to talk to them about what it's like, what their cases are like, that kind of a thing.
Yeah, you might be able to shadow or just like working. So I had like internships that through my university they set up. I was working with it was a program where it was a program for people who had been through the court system, mandated because of child abuse or neglect cases. They had to take this parental course. And so I went along, shadowed this woman, and she went to people's homes, and you had to do home inspections about the conditions that the children were living in. And you had to do this like parenting course with the parents. This was court mandated. So that was like a very hands-on, interesting experience. I don't think I was just learning for me, just like seeing the realities of people's lives. Or I did like a different in my grad program. I was in New York, so I had an internship at the United Nations. That gave me a sense of like how bureaucratic big organizations can be, and that was like somewhat, as an idealistic student, somewhat disillusioning, just seeing like the mechanisms of big bureaucracies and how they churn things through.
Can you talk a bit more about that and what your experience was like there? And because right now you're doing very much the opposite, right? You're starting your own thing. You have quite a lot of say so in how things go, and you could have designed the programs very much yourself. But what was that internship, and describe some of those frustrations?
Sure. I mean, I guess specifically, I was working with the International Federation of Social Workers, as a social work student, and they're kind of working at this high level, trying to advocate for different positions. And so we'd write position papers on. I kind of looking back, I find it amusing, but we'd write a position paper on like Indigenous rights. I don't think I'd ever really met an Indigenous person at that point, and so like I don't know how we could I don't know, this is like a long time ago, but yeah, how that could happen. And so it's just yeah, I think that's, it's kind of funny looking back at that. I think what's also really valuable for students also is if they're interested in working in national development space, is like taking those student trips and doing the volunteer thing. Because you probably won't be, as a student volunteer, maybe not that impactful, but it will like help you to have a broader experience for yourself of understanding and seeing different parts of the world and understanding different cultures, and just it gives you like a wider perspective. So I think those trips are 100% worth it. And if you can get a longer term volunteer position, like 6 or 4 months in a place, and where you're actually able to spend time in a community, learn a language, is really critical. Anybody interested in international development, it is critical to have like a foreign language, and thinking about like where do you want to work, and if you want to be in Africa, then it's going to be like French or Swahili or somewhere with specific local language, or obviously Latin American Spanish. But being able to communicate locally with people is absolutely critical. And so that would be another thing to kind of focus on as you're interested in that, is developing your foreign language abilities. Would be a very specific and strong piece of career advice I'd give somebody. But kind of, and just like looping that around, again, this is like, this organization is Effective Altruism for Christians, is I would say is like, I think there's something to remember of like, I think we know this, but then sometimes we forget, is seeing people as individuals that like the individual in the group. And what I'm trying to say is like, we can think about impact in the space of like, okay, I can help like these thousands and thousands of people or get to this specific thing. It's like remembering there's like that individual and that individual life tied there. And so with that, it's I guess I'm trying to think about with that is like how to think about your impact in terms of like who are the specific people that are going to be benefiting, and not just like thinking of as like a big picture abstract number, but like caring for the individuals. And that could be very much like, it is like caring, balancing like your big picture impact with also just being very involved in the people who God has put in your individual life path, and not underestimating the value of that.
Has your approach towards mental health in your vocation, has it differed in any extreme ways because you are a Christian? Do you think that the models of effective mental health for a Christian will be very different than the models of effective mental health for non-Christians working at secular charities. So could you speak for a minute or two about that and maybe what a Christian should be uniquely aware of when entering this space?
Yeah, I think as a Christian or as a person who doesn't consider themselves to be a Christian, there's definitely like a solid base of like wanting to do a therapy that is based on the evidence and is based on like solid practice, and that is like a solid baseline. Um, Somebody coming in as a Christian, then I think the difference would be if you're working with someone who also shares your that faith and they've expressed that, I think you can use that as like a source of strength, and use that as a way to be able to find that commonality and help them to be able to use that as like a place to find support, whether it's in their church or if their individual relationship with God. Um, and that can be like very meaningful. Again, it's like being very respectful of like knowing that person also shares that and also is like open to that. Um, but I think that can be a place to like be able to find those commonalities. And so and if that's the person's open to it, it could either be something like, again, it's like being very respectful, but you could be praying together or like sharing a psalm that's about affliction, and using that as a place of support. Again, really focusing not pushing that on people, and keeping overall the therapy based on evidence-based practices is key. Um, but if there is that openness, like that sharing is what really does helps it kind of go to a next level sort of space. And so I think when that does occasionally happen, it's really, really quite special. Um, so yeah, I think that's like kind of way. And then I personally, and then just privately outside of like the actual interactions with the people is very much like seeking God in prayer. And so what that looks like for me is like really just praying for the people that we're working with and praying for their individual circumstances and praying that God is working in their life. And overall, I think that is like where it comes in for me, is just like my overall orientation is that understanding of God cares about people and who are the least of these. And so I think that recognition of everyone, that I think that does very much fit in with like a mental health approach and like, or a interest in kind of development is like people have value beyond the value of what they might be able to contribute to society. And so I think that is like, as a Christian, we see the individual as somebody who really matters because God has sees them as being valuable. And so that's like a unique perspective that Christianity brings.
One final question. So, do you have any thoughts about whether somebody who's interested in making an impact in this space should pursue earning to give to effective charities like Strong Minds, like Vida Plena, or so forth, uh, versus doing direct work, maybe being a startup founder in the space or supporting a startup like yours? Any thoughts on that? And then also related to that, are you hiring now or in the near term future?
Yeah, we are hiring, but we're only hiring Ecuadorians locally as group facilitators. However, it would be great to connect with anybody who's interested in volunteering, specifically grad students around like research or doing thesis research. I think that would really love to connect with anybody in that kind of space, to be able to again best focus on our impact. Um, and so that would be kind of that, and then kind of like bigger questions. I think going back to the original thought of like the body of Christ, and it you're personally love working more directly with people or want to do more that sort of work, I think that follow that impulse, follow that calling. And if you feel that, like that I have, you're like, what you're like, or the other side, you're like, I'm a great coder and I really enjoy coding, then like maybe just expect that is like understanding those kind of like callings and that like there's a space for different people and not one is not better from the other. Um, and I know it's like it's probably a little bit too harsh, hard to like, that's maybe not helpful, but it's more just like taking the pressure off of like, there's one correct path or the other. It's going to be very individual. And going back to those like internship experiences, like trying things out and seeing what actually fits and feels good to you.
Mm. Yeah, that's definitely takes the pressure off. Thank you so much, Joy. We're really excited about your work. We would love to include a link to your contact info or Vida Plena, whatever you'd like us to include there. But thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us. And we look forward to talking again or seeing you at a Christians for Impact or each event in the future.
Thank you so much.
Thanks so much to both of you guys and just everyone else listening, just your interest in this topic and the great work that you are going to be doing. So thanks for both of you this opportunity.
Absolutely. Take care.
Bye-bye. Thanks.
Hi, listeners. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If you're thinking about being connected to Joy or other Christians who care about effective mental health, if you're considering a career in mental health and you want to help as many people as possible and help the poorest of the poor to have a restored relationship, not only with themselves and their own minds, but with their communities and with God, we would love to help you learn about really promising projects. We would love to help you brainstorm potential projects for yourself. We have mentors who've thought about this, so we would love to get them in touch with you. Go to christiansforimpact.org. You can also listen to other podcast episodes we have on similar poverty-related themes, like our episode with Brian Fickert, Paul Niehaus, and Katie Fantaguzzi.